On December 31st, 2025, hundreds of thousands of people in Moscow welcomed the new year by candlelight. Not because it was romantic, not because it was symbolic, but because the power was gone. As midnight approached, lights flickered across entire districts of Russia's capital. Phone signals dropped, elevators stopped, heating systems failed, water pumps shut down, and in the dead of winter, one of the coldest cities on Earth went dark. At almost the exact same moment, Vladimir Putin appeared on television to deliver his annual New Year's address. He stood in front of the Kremlin, wearing a black suit, calm and composed, and told the Russian people that their country was united, strong, and winning. But outside that carefully staged broadcast, reality was collapsing. Because this wasn't just a blackout, it wasn't just a technical failure, and it wasn't just bad timing. This was the opening moment of one of the most coordinated and strategically significant Ukrainian attacks of the entire war, an operation designed not just to damage infrastructure, but to shatter the illusion that Moscow was untouchable. And once you put all the pieces together, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. Let's start with the power outage itself. On the evening of December 31st, large parts of Moscow's surrounding suburbs suddenly lost electricity. Entire neighborhoods in places like Ramenskoye, Zhukovsky, and Lyubertsy were plunged into darkness. Russian officials rushed to explain it away. They claimed it was a technological failure, a damaged cable, an unfortunate coincidence. But that explanation didn't hold for long, because at the exact same time the lights went out, Russia's own defense ministry was issuing emergency updates. They claimed their air defenses had shot down more than 100 Ukrainian drones in just 4 hours. That alone raised serious questions. Then Moscow's mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, posted on Telegram confirming that Ukrainian drones had been intercepted over the Moscow region, including drones heading directly toward the capital itself. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't social media rumors. This was the Kremlin admitting that Moscow was under aerial attack. Soon after, reports began emerging that up to 600,000 people were affected by the blackout. No electricity, no mobile service, no internet. Total isolation. Former Ukrainian presidential spokesperson Yulia Mendel described it simply: Moscow is in the dark. And this wasn't limited to one neighborhood. New Year's Eve, without heat, water, or power. As the night went on, another blackout hit the Domodedovo district near Moscow. This wasn't just about lights. Residents were left without heating, water supply, basic utilities. Local authorities confirmed a system-wide failure affecting multiple districts, central, western, and northern parts of the area. Think about what that means. This wasn't summer. This was Russian winter. Temperatures well below freezing, families trapped in apartments with no heat, elderly residents, children, and hospital patients suddenly vulnerable. And all of this was happening while Putin was preparing to tell the nation that Russia was strong, stable, and victorious. But the cracks were already impossible to hide. Moscow's airports grind to a halt. And then the chaos spread. As Ukrainian drones continued flying toward the Moscow region, all 4 of the capital's major airports were forced to impose flight restrictions. Sheremetyevo, Domodedovo, Vnukovo, Zhukovsky. Flights were delayed, flights were canceled. Thousands of passengers were stranded. Families trying to reunite for the holidays were stuck sleeping on terminal floors. Business travelers were grounded. Cargo flights were rerouted or abandoned entirely. And this wasn't an isolated event. Throughout December 2025, there were multiple nights when all 4 Moscow airports suspended operations simultaneously due to drone threats. On one night alone, more than 200 flights were delayed or canceled. This is the kind of disruption you expect during a natural disaster, not in the capital of a nuclear-armed superpower. Why this night was different by itself, a blackout, is embarrassing. By itself, airport disruptions are frustrating. But taken together, and timed precisely with Putin's most important speech of the year, this was something else entirely. This was psychological warfare. Because New Year's Eve in Russia isn't just another holiday, it's the most important night of the year. It's when families gather. It's when people reflect. It's when the president speaks directly to the nation. And for 3 years, Putin had carefully maintained the same message. The war is far away. Life is normal. Russia is winning. That illusion shattered on December 31st, 2025. Putin's speech versus reality. Putin's address lasted just 3 minutes and 20 seconds. That was notable in itself. Before the war, His New Year's speeches were short and symbolic. During the war, they became longer and more defensive. This time, he went back to the old format, as if trying to signal that everything was normal again. He didn't mention Ukraine. He didn't mention peace talks. He didn't mention plans to end the war. Instead, he spoke about destiny, unity, and sacrifice. He told Russian soldiers, "You have taken on the responsibility to fight for your native land, for truth and justice. Millions of people are with you. We believe in you and in our victory." But outside that broadcast, refineries were burning. Airports were paralyzed. Hundreds of thousands of citizens sat in the dark. That contrast mattered more than any words he spoke, because authoritarian systems rely on one thing above all else: control of perception. And that control was slipping. This wasn't random. It was a message. Ukraine didn't need to occupy Moscow to send a signal. It didn't need tanks rolling through Red Square. All it needed was this: to prove that Russia's capital, the heart of its power, prestige, and propaganda, was vulnerable. And that's exactly what happened. Because while Moscow was struggling with blackouts and flight chaos, something far more important was happening elsewhere in Russia. Something that would strike at the very foundation of Putin's war economy: oil. Setting the stage for what comes next. What happened on New Year's Eve wasn't an isolated incident. It was the opening act of a coordinated nationwide campaign that targeted power infrastructure, transportation hubs, oil refineries, fuel depots, strategic reserves, facilities that Russia assumed were untouchable. And this is where the story shifts from disruption to devastation. Now we're going to look at what was burning while Moscow went dark, and why Ukraine's real target wasn't just infrastructure, but the money that keeps Russia's war alive. Oil refineries, export terminals, fuel depots, hit one by one, including some more than 1,000 kilometers inside Russia. And once you understand that strategy, you start to see why this war is entering a completely different phase. While Moscow was sitting in darkness on New Year's Eve, something else was lighting up the Russian skyline. But these weren't fireworks, they were refinery fires, because the blackout in Moscow wasn't the main event, it was the distraction. The real damage was happening hundreds, and in some cases, more than 1,000, miles away, at the beating heart of Russia's war economy: oil. Why oil is Russia's lifeline. To understand why these attacks matter, you need to understand one basic fact about Russia. Russia is not a diversified economy, it is an energy state. Oil and gas revenues fund the military, the federal budget, social payments, infrastructure, and most importantly, political stability. For decades, oil money has allowed the Kremlin to paper over inefficiency, corruption, and stagnation. And since the invasion of Ukraine, oil has become even more critical. Missiles don't build themselves. Tanks don't fuel themselves. Armies don't fight without diesel. So when Ukraine began targeting Russian oil infrastructure, it wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. The first fire: Tuapse refinery. On New Year's Eve, Ukrainian drones struck the Tuapse oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar region. This refinery is not some minor facility. Tuapse is one of Russia's top 10 largest oil refineries, processing around 12 million tons of petroleum products per year. More importantly, it plays a direct role in supplying fuel to the Russian military, especially operations in southern Ukraine and occupied territories. After the strike, a fire broke out. The primary processing unit was damaged. Emergency crews were deployed. Russian authorities admitted that. 2 people were injured. 5 residential buildings were damaged. A port pier was hit. A gas pipeline was damaged. This alone would have been headline news, but this was only the beginning. The Black Sea bottleneck. Just hours later, Ukraine struck again. This time, the target was the Taman oil terminal on the Taman Peninsula, one of the largest oil terminals in the entire Black Sea region. This facility handles crude oil storage, petroleum products, liquefied hydrocarbon gas, export shipments to global markets. In other words, this isn't just about domestic fuel. This is about export revenue. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces confirmed that oil loading racks were damaged, port infrastructure was knocked out, the terminal was rendered inoperable. When oil can't move, money doesn't flow, and that's the point. A new year, another refinery fire. As the clock struck midnight and 2026 began, Russia's first refinery fire of the year was already burning. The Ilsky oil refinery, also in Krasnodar, was hit by Ukrainian loitering munitions. This facility processes over 6 million tons of oil annually and is a key fuel supplier for Russia's southern military districts. Ukraine's general staff confirmed the strike. A fire broke out. Operations were halted. Another piece of Russia's fuel network went offline. And again, this wasn't random, this was timing. Ukraine was sending a message: the war doesn't pause for holidays, and neither do we. The strike that shocked Moscow. But the most alarming strike for the Kremlin came next. Ukrainian drones hit the Almatyevsk oil processing facility in Tatarstan. Let that sink in. This facility is located over 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine's border. For years, Russia believed regions like Tatarstan were completely safe. Too far, too deep, too protected. That assumption is now dead. This strike proved that Ukraine could reach deep into Russia's industrial heartland, places that house critical infrastructure, skilled workers, and strategic assets. Nowhere was off limits anymore. This wasn't about damage, it was about system failure. Each refinery fire matters, but the real impact isn't measured in flames, it's measured in disruption. Because oil refining is not easily replaceable. When a refinery goes offline, fuel shortages appear downstream, transportation networks are disrupted, military supply chains slow down, export contracts are missed, and when multiple refineries are hit in rapid succession, the system starts to break. That's exactly what Ukraine was aiming for. December 2025, a record-breaking month. By the end of December 2025, the numbers were staggering. Reports indicate 24 separate strikes on Russian energy infrastructure in December alone. Diesel exports fell to 5-year lows. Fuel shortages appeared in more than 50 Russian regions. Gas stations began rationing fuel. Some regions restricted sales, others raised prices. Long lines returned, something Russians hadn't seen in years. And this wasn't happening quietly. People noticed. Strategic reserves under attack. One of the most serious developments was Ukraine's strike on a state fuel storage facility belonging to Rosreserve. Rosreserve isn't just another company. It manages Russia's strategic fuel reserves, the stockpiles meant for national emergencies, wars, natural disasters, supply shocks. These reserves are supposed to be untouchable, but they weren't. Hitting Rosreserve sends a chilling message. Even Russia's emergency backstop is vulnerable. Why the Kremlin can't stop this? Russia's air defenses are designed to stop. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, high-altitude threats, Ukrainian drones are different. They're cheap, numerous, low-flying, hard to detect. And Russia has thousands of kilometers of infrastructure to protect. Pipelines, refineries, depots, ports. Defending all of it is impossible, which means Ukraine doesn't need to destroy everything. It just needs to keep striking often enough to create uncertainty, delays, and fear. And that's exactly what's happening. The economic damage begins to show. By late 2025, the impact was measurable. According to international energy analysts, Russia's oil product export revenues fell sharply. Profits in the oil and gas sector dropped by over 50% year on year. Russia was forced to import gasoline from Asian markets. That last point is critical. Russia, one of the world's largest energy producers, importing fuel, that's not normal. That's a system under strain. The war comes home. For most Russians, the war had been something distant, something on television, something happening somewhere else. But fuel shortages change that. Blackouts change that. Airport shutdowns change that. When you can't heat your home, drive your car, or travel to see family, the war becomes personal. And that's what Ukraine understands. What this means going forward. The New Year's strikes marked a turning point. Ukraine demonstrated reach coordination, strategic intent. It wasn't just fighting Russian soldiers anymore, it was attacking Russia's ability to sustain the war itself. And that brings us to the next phase of the story. Because while oil facilities were burning, another crisis was unfolding quietly, one that threatens Russia far more than any single drone strike: the economy. By the end of 2025, the damage to Russia wasn't just visible in burning refineries or darkened cities, it was visible in the budget. Because behind the scenes, the Russian economy was being pushed to its breaking point. Here's the key number. In 2025, defense and security spending consumed about 40% of Russia's entire government budget. Let that sink in. That's more than what Russia spends on education, healthcare, social welfare, infrastructure, and the civilian economy. Combined, According to independent estimates, Russia's military spending reached 15.5 trillion rubles, roughly 7% of GDP. That level of spending is not sustainable, especially when your main source of income is shrinking. Oil revenue collapse. Oil and gas revenues are the backbone of Russia's finances. But in 2025, oil and gas revenue fell by 22% compared to 2024. Export income dropped to 5-year lows. Profits in the oil and gas sector fell by over 50%. This is the same sector funding the war, so the math becomes brutal. If your military spending stays massive and your energy revenue collapses, something has to give. And Putin chose not to cut the war. He chose to squeeze the population. Taxes, inflation, and debt. To keep the war going, the Kremlin raised taxes. VAT increased from 20% to 22%. Small businesses were pulled into the tax system. Utility prices rose by nearly 12%. New fees were introduced on imports and consumer goods. At the same time, inflation surged. To stop prices from spiraling out of control, Russia's central bank raised interest rates as high as 21%. Even now, rates remain around 16%. That's devastating. At those rates, mortgages become unaffordable. Small businesses can't borrow, investment dries up. Russian companies are now spending nearly 40% of their profits just to service debt. That's money not going to wages, innovation, or growth. The labor crisis. Official unemployment in Russia is extremely low, around 2%, but that's not good news. It means Russia has run out of workers. Why? Because hundreds of thousands of working-age men are either mobilized, killed, wounded, or gone. Ukraine's commander-in-chief reported that in 2025 alone, Russia recruited about 406,000 soldiers, but lost more than 410,000. That's a net loss. And that doesn't include the people who simply left the country. The brain drain. Since 2022, at least 650,000 Russians have left and not returned. And these aren't random migrants. About 80% have higher education. Tens of thousands work in IT, engineering, science, and medicine. Russia lost over 50,000 IT specialists alone. These are exactly the people needed to modernize an economy. Once they leave, they don't come back, especially during a war, and without them, long-term growth becomes impossible. Ordinary people pay the price. While military factory wages jumped by 30 to 60%, pensions lagged far behind inflation. The average pension now equals about $150 to $200 per month. Food prices surged, especially staples like potatoes. Nearly 1 in 3 Russians now struggle to afford basic food. The message is clear. The state prioritizes war over welfare. By New Year's Eve 2025, something fundamental had changed. For years, the Kremlin told Russians the war was distant, that life was normal, that stability was guaranteed. But that night, the war came home. The lights went out, the heat stopped, flights were grounded, refineries burned. And for the first time, hundreds of thousands of Russians experienced the war not through television, but through darkness in their own homes. The 2026 budget tells the real story. Russia's 2026 budget makes one thing clear. The Kremlin is planning for years more of war. Defense and security spending will still make up nearly 38% of the budget, and the government has left itself room to spend even more, quietly hiding costs in other categories. This is not a country preparing for peace. This is a country doubling down. The trap. Russia is now stuck in a cycle it can't escape. More war spending creates more inflation. Inflation forces higher interest rates. High rates crush civilian businesses. Weaker businesses mean less tax revenue. Less revenue means higher taxes. And higher taxes make life harder for everyone. Breaking this cycle would require cutting military spending, ending the war, rebuilding trust. But doing that would be an admission of failure. So the Kremlin keeps going. History rhymes. This is where history matters. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because it lost a single battle. It collapsed because military spending consumed the economy, innovation stagnated, infrastructure crumbled, citizens lost faith, guns replaced butter. Sound familiar? Russia today faces massive military spending, economic isolation, brain drain, aging infrastructure. A leadership detached from reality. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it does rhyme. The message of that night. Ukraine's New Year's Eve strikes weren't just military operations. They were a message that said, there's no safe place anymore. Your capital is vulnerable. Your economy is bleeding. And perhaps most importantly, the war cannot be kept far away forever. The question that remains. So the real question isn't whether Russia can keep fighting, it's how long. How many more refineries have to burn? How many more engineers have to leave? How many more pensions fall behind prices? How many more nights without heat or power? That dark night in Moscow wasn't just a blackout, it was a preview, a glimpse of what happens when a country spends its future on war and runs out of ways to hide the cost from its own people.